Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. This video is meant for AP World Skyline High School 2019-2020 Globalization. And if you haven't done so yet, remember you can go here to get the curriculum. I didn't have an opportunity to pass around copies of the Unit 9 curriculum, but here it is. If you're following along up here, it's page 162, or if you're following along down here, it's page 155. But the curriculum for AP World for 2019-2020. So, Key Standard 9.1, identify patterns among or connections between historical developments and processes. So, this is going to require us to start getting into like how the past connects to the present. So, we're really going to focus here on the skill, change, and continuity over time. So, Key Standard 9.1 is going to introduce us to, at first, advances in technology and exchange. So, the curriculum reads new modes of communication, including radio communication, cellular communication, and the internet, as well as transportation, including air travel and shipping containers, reduce the problem of geographic distance. So, first off, is the radio. The radio actually was invented just before this unit starts in 1896 by Marconi. It was patented, and the world's first wireless telegraphy came about. Its first uses were in maritime use, so think of the Titanic, right? Trying to radio back that the Titanic is sinking, right? But it really came into its own in World War I, thanks to its uses in communicating what was going on in the war. But then, of course, after World War I, it became even more important. So this, for example, the Volksempfänger was distributed out in Germany and became one of the most important tools in helping to communicate across Nazi ideology. That, of course, ended up leading to the rise of fascism in Germany and, of course, all of the problems that came about as a result of World War II. So next up is the telephone. It was first invented again just before this unit starts in 1876. It was invented by Alexander Graham Bell, who sent the first message of clear speech. Telephones were the first way people could speak to each other across long distances. And of course, eventually in 1973, Motorola would invent the first cell phone. It was huge. It was like 4 pounds, but initially using radio networks. Now we use like cell towers to communicate across information. And really important today is, say, the iPhone, which is able to use, say, the internet, which was introduced in the late 70s with ARPANET. It was used to link together science and research institutions, and it was developed to transfer information. By the late 1980s, internet service providers emerged for public use. The automobile really came around, horseless carriages in the late 19th century. Carl Benz invented the first motor wagon or the car. And of course, in the United States, most famous for cars is Henry Ford, who was by 1924 producing a new Model T every 24 seconds. The airplane is really important. Also, in 1903, the Wright brothers flew in North Carolina. Later on, jet technology would develop during World War II, which would eventually get us to where we are today, where we can have commercial flights. And commercial flights, of course, are going to end up being really, really important for connecting the world together, and hence the reason why we have like globalization the way that we talk about it. So if you click on this link, you can see an example of trying to show all of these flights that happen all over planet Earth. And it should help to get you an idea of just how crazy interconnected this globalized world really is. So next up are these things, shipping containers, which have become the pretty standard way that companies around the globe have begun to ship commercial goods back and forth. Energy technologies, including the use of petroleum and nuclear power, raised productivity and increased the production of material goods. So, again, really super duper important is oil. I was just looking recently, the number two corporation in the world on the Fortune 500 was ExxonMobil, an oil company. Many of them are some of the wealthiest companies on the planet. Uh, the production of material goods, you can see tons of examples of this. If you click on this link here, you can see the crash course guys use their example of a t-shirt, and a t-shirt is a really good example for increasing production of material goods. But in general, I tend to focus more on plastic goods because they're responsible for so much of what is produced nowadays, and of course has led to one of the biggest crises on planet Earth, that is the problem of plastic pollution. The world produces about 300 million tons of plastic waste each year, and about 8 million of that ends up flowing into the oceans, which oftentimes will just get ground up into smaller and smaller particles, which can produce a real problem when it comes to, say, plastic pollution. Plastic pollution, of course, ends up happening in the oceans and is formed into these huge garbage patches that get stuck in the oceans because of the flow of the water, and has become a major problem when it comes to, say, fish. If you click on some of these links here, you can see Dr. Greger, for instance, talk about how yes, clearly in the oceans, plastic gets into fish. If human beings then eat it, they can get cancer from eating that fish, and has created a huge problem. Interestingly, the World Economic Forum here will talk to us about how a lot of this pollution in the ocean really comes from only about 10 rivers, where they are not well regulating their pollution, and it ends up flowing into the oceans. Next is birth control, more effective forms of birth control, like, for instance, vulcanized rubber condoms in the 1920s, or the pill, which really comes into its own in the 1960s, gave women greater control over fertility and transformed reproductive practices and contributed to declining rates of fertility in much of the world. And this definitely has been the case. Fertility has been going way down, and it's expected that by, say, 2045 to 2050, the global average of fertility will get down to about 2.3, and then by 2095 maybe as low as 1.99. Human population in 2050 is estimated to be about 9.15 billion people, with a range of somewhere between almost 8 to, say, 11 billion people. Next is the Green Revolution and advances in technology related to food production. If you'll remember from way back earlier in the class, we talked about how food ends up being a very strange sort of human technology because of adaptations we make to the types of foods. And the Green Revolution, in short, is usually associated with this guy named Norman Borlaug, who is so important into helping to develop new seed varieties of especially wheat that are responsible for increased production and increased yields in the amount of wheat. But similar things happen with maize, corn, potatoes, and other farm products also. The key standard reads: the Green Revolution and commercial agriculture increased productivity and sustained the Earth's growing population as it spread chemically and genetically modified forms of agriculture. The Green Revolution, again, in short, it refers to the period between the 1930s and the 1960s that led to increased agricultural production worldwide. Norman Borlaug, who ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, is credited with saving billions of lives by developing high-yield cereal grains. Again, he's most well known with wheat, but other examples would be corn or maize, hybridized seeds, and synthetic fertilizer and pesticides. Norman Borlaug was able to put together this type of wheat that came from Japan called Norin 10 that was a dwarf variety. It had a shorter stalk and so was able to avoid something that's called lodging. As they started using more and more fertilizers, the seeds on the wheat got bigger and bigger. But the problem was the Norin 10 or the ones before Norin 10 would get so heavy on the top with the seed that it would lean over and lay on the ground and eventually rot before they could use it well. So Norman Borlaug was able to take these types of wheat that were shorter and didn't lean over when the seeds got heavier, and as a result produce massively more in the way of yields from wheat. So, for example, this guy here, right? Norman Borlaug and this wheat that he was able to produce. Norman Borlaug, in his speech, which you can read here, commented that we were able to use science to massively produce more food on planet Earth. But the problem, of course, is that the population has continued to just go up and up and up and up, something that Borlaug himself called the population monster, suggesting that most people don't truly recognize the population increase and how big of a threat it poses to people on planet Earth. Anyway, next is commercial agriculture. With the development of the Industrial Revolution and commercial mechanized farm machinery, the output of food drastically increased from 1700 to 1980. The total area of cultivated land on planet Earth increased in that time by about 466%. Farms moved out of the hands of individuals and into big businesses. So, like, for example, in the United States, 4 companies are responsible for about 81% of beef production. They are Tyson, Cargill, JBS, or what's also known as Swift, and the National Beef Corporation. Next is genetically modified crops, which have also allowed for increasing yields and increasing the amount of food on planet Earth. Genetically modified crops are plants that have been modified using genetic engineering. Often they are genetically engineered so that they can resist pests, or so they can reduce spoilage, or so they can improve the nutrients or the amino acids inside the crops. Roughly 10% of Earth's arable land grows genetically modified crops, and they have reduced chemical pesticide use by about 37%. Very important has been the reduction in, say, DDT, increased crop yields by 22%, and increased farmer profits by 68%. So you can see stuff like this, just these massive cornfields, like, for instance, say outside of Fargo, North Dakota or something, soybean production like you can see here, that just go on and on off into the distance. So one of the things that's really important to understand as we get into the more contemporary world is that the percentage of biomass of all land mammals on planet Earth. Humans and livestock make up the vast majority of the land animals on planet Earth, and all the wild animals that still exist only make up a very small percentage. So you've got to understand, mostly it's human beings, our pets, and our livestock, and that's about it. On planet Earth, humans produce something like 70 billion land animals per year in order to mostly produce that for food. And of course, say, beef, right? Cattle. It requires a huge amount of land and resources to produce just a little bit of, say, beef. And so this ends up taking up more and more of the planet's land and resources as we go along. Again, something about 466% more land was being taken under cultivation in the period between 1700 and 1980. Now, we were able to feed that population with a lot of innovations, genetically modified crops the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and plant varieties like those produced by Norman Borlaug, which were able to feed that population. But increasingly today, that has led more and more to taking new land under cultivation that had not been before. And that's led to deforestation, for instance, in the Amazon basin, something that has increasingly been occurring with inside the last year. When we started this class back in August, in the news, there was just tons and tons of information about all these fires that were going on all over the Amazon as farmers were taking in more and more land and putting it under cultivation. Of course, cattle ranching is the largest driver of this deforestation in every Amazon county, accounting for 80% of current deforestation rates. Amazon Brazil is home to approximately 200 million head of cattle and is the largest exporter in the world, supplying about 1/4 of the global market. So that introduces us again to one of the biggest issues in the world, and that is deforestation in the Amazon, which is primarily happening because of taking land under cultivation to feed cattle or to graze cattle or to raise crops that would mostly be fed to cattle. Next is medical innovations. Medical innovations, including vaccines and antibiotics, increase the ability of human beings to survive and to live longer lives. Now, we've been seeing, say, inoculation against smallpox for a very long time before this unit even starts. But starting in the 1920s, there starts to be a lot of major improvements in vaccines. So, diseases that you probably don't have that we have developed strong vaccines against are tuberculosis in 1921, whooping cough in 1926, typhoid fever in 1937. After World War II got over, there was a lot of worry that there was going to be another pandemic of flu the way that there was after World War I. And so Jonas Salk, very importantly, helped to develop a vaccine for the flu that became widely available in 1945 and prevented the same type of flu from spreading throughout the world after World War II the way that it had after World War I. Now, Jonas Salk is actually quite a lot more famous for the vaccine that he developed for polio in 1952 to 1953. Measles, of course, we developed a vaccine in 1963, rubella in 1970, and on and on and on and on. There's been a lot of development in improvements in vaccinations from 1900 to present, and of course, antibiotics as well. In 1928, this guy, Alexander Fleming, noticed this thing called penicillium, which helped to prevent staph from growing, and the first antibiotic was born, penicillin. By 1944, over 2 million doses were available for U.S. troops that were landing on the beaches at Normandy and ended up being a huge issue inside World War II and afterwards. But of course, this has led to one of the biggest problems on the planet today, which is antibiotic resistance, that a lot of microbes are starting to develop that are beginning to resist the antibiotics that we have. So, for instance, if we look here at the World Health Organization, they tell us that antibiotic resistance is one of the biggest threats to global health, food security, and development today. Antibiotic resistance is leading to a bunch of infections that were easily treated with antibiotics, like pneumonia, tuberculosis, and gonorrhea, and so on, that are becoming resistant to these antibiotics that we have developed. And of course, it's important to note that most antibiotics on the planet are not even really given out by doctors to people who are sick with stuff that could be treated. Most of it's given out by, say, farmers who give antibiotics in their feed to animals. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that is Key Standard 9.1 for AP World. I'll see you in the next video.